Forensic Tales discusses topics that some listeners may find disturbing. The contents of this episode may not be suitable for everyone. Listener discretion is advised.
When police in Oklahoma got a call from a woman saying a man wearing only gloves and a pair of underwear broke into her house, killed her boyfriend, and tortured her for hours, it seemed almost too far-fetched to be true. But as detectives combed through the forensic evidence at the scene, it seemed to line up perfectly with her story. What they didn't realize at the time was that this brutal attack was connected to a predator who had been quietly slipping in and out of homes for years, watching, stalking, and committing crimes no one ever saw coming. For nearly 2 decades, he managed to evade capture. And when investigators finally uncovered who he was, the truth revealed a disturbing pattern. A man who had been hiding in plain sight while secretly living a double life as a voyeur, a prowler, and eventually a killer. This is Forensic Tales, episode 328, The Oklahoma Peeping Tom Killer. Welcome to Forensic Tales. I'm your host, Courtney Fretwell. Forensic Tales is a weekly crime podcast with a forensic twist. Each episode features real stories highlighting how forensic science was used to uncover the truth. If you enjoy deep dives into real cases and the science behind them, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an episode. And if you want even more content, including monthly full-length bonus episodes and early ad-free access to over 300 episodes, you can join our community over on Patreon. The support there truly helps keep the show going. To learn more, visit patreon.com/forensictales. And one small favor that makes a huge difference for the show, if you're enjoying Forensic Tales, please consider leaving a positive review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps other listeners discover the podcast. It's the night of August 16th, 1986 in Edmond, Oklahoma. If it were any other night, the town would be pretty quiet. But the sense of security and calm that usually floats through the air was about to be crushed for 2 of its residents. It was well into the middle of the night when officers at the Edmond Police Department got a frantic phone call from a woman. And the story she had to tell was straight out of a horror film. She said her boyfriend had been stabbed to death and she had been terrorized and assaulted for hours. Detective Scott Day from the Edmond Police Department was the first officer on scene that early morning. He was also the first one to see 27-year-old Gary Larson lying lifeless, covered in blood and stab wounds by the couple's front door. An autopsy would later reveal that he'd been stabbed a total of 24 times across his chest and stomach, and was dead by the time Detective Day and his colleagues arrived. Knowing there was nothing they could do to help Gary Larson, the police officers turned their attention to his girlfriend, a young woman whom I won't name in this podcast, out of respect for her identity. And the story she had to tell made even the most seasoned detectives squirm. She said earlier that night her boyfriend, Gary, had gone to bed before her. It was a hot, humid summer night, and he wanted to turn in early. So she stayed up watching TV alone for a while. Sometime around midnight, she went to bed herself. The house had cooled down a little, and she was ready to call it a night. She must have only been asleep for an hour when she and Gary heard some strange noises coming from the living room. They knew it was the middle of the night, so the house should have been dead quiet. They were the only 2 people there, or so they thought. She said Gary was the one who got up first to go investigate, but within moments of him leaving the bedroom, she heard screams and the sound of a struggle, That's when she jumped out of bed and ran toward the living room, but she didn't have time to grab her glasses. So, between the house being pitch dark and not wearing her glasses, she wasn't able to see much at all. But she was able to make out that a man attacked her boyfriend right there in the middle of the living room. She said he was only wearing a pair of gloves and boxer shorts. Other than that, he was completely naked. No shirt, no shoes, just his underwear and a pair of gloves. The man then chased the woman back into the bedroom, leaving Gary severely wounded from the attack on the floor. This was only the beginning. For the next several hours, this man did anything and everything under the sun to this poor woman. She was assaulted. She was suffocated multiple times to the point of almost passing out. And while this was happening, she was pleading with him to spare her life. She was practically begging him to leave her alone. She would do whatever he wanted. She just didn't want him to kill her. And this strategy seemed to work. Because after several hours of assaulting her, the mystery man got up and left the house. Once she was able to free herself, she went straight to the living room looking for her boyfriend, Gary. But as soon as she touched him, she knew she needed to call for help right away. And that's when the call to the Edmond Police Department was made. Detective Day and the other officers knew right away that this wasn't a crime they could handle on their own. There was a man who had been stabbed to death and a woman who claimed to have been assaulted for about 3 hours. This wasn't a typical crime you'd see committed in a place like Edmond. So the local police department requested help from the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation. The female victim was taken to the local hospital to be treated for her injuries, and back at the house, the police got to work collecting evidence. The first thing they encountered was Gary Larson's body, which was lying on its back near a wall in the kitchen. He was only wearing a pair of boxer shorts, which made sense because, according to his girlfriend, the attack happened when they were asleep. It was also a hot summer night, so you'd want to sleep in as few clothes as possible to keep cool, especially in a house without air conditioning. Not far from Gary's body, the police saw a pretty large dent in the wall near the dining room area. It was also covered in a good amount of blood, suggesting to them that's where he was first attacked. It was almost like the dented wall made a perfect outline of Gary's body. And the police's assumptions were correct. The medical examiner would later determine that Gary had been thrown against the wall in a surprise attack. The first stab wound to his chest went through his entire body, and it was only the second stab wound that would leave him incapacitated. That meant the killer went on to stab him an additional 22 times. That was something they didn't have to do. Gary was very clearly incapacitated and not going to come after him following that second stab wound to the chest. So whoever this killer was, they clearly went overboard. Based on the amount of blood and the wounds the officers could clearly see across his chest and stomach, they knew he had been stabbed. But they also knew they had to wait for the medical examiner to get there before moving his body. So they focused their attention on other parts of the house, looking for more clues, and that's when they saw the bloody footprints. Right there on the floor, leading away from Gary's body, was a set of bloody footprints. But the interesting part wasn't the fact that they found prints. That's very common at these types of crime scenes, whether it's shoe prints or fingerprints. It was the fact that they came barefoot, so the killer didn't have any shoes on. The police then conducted a luminol test throughout the rest of the house, trying to determine where the footprints led. This all happened in the mid-'80s, so luminol testing was still relatively new at the time. The bloody prints found near Gary's body led straight to the bedroom where the female victim said she had been attacked. So this seemed to line up perfectly with her story. But that's not all the luminol test revealed. As the officers followed the prints, they noticed that the screen in the dining room window had been sliced open, suggesting that's how the killer gained access to the home. Then, underneath the master bedroom window on the outside of the home, they found even more clues. Another bare footprint impression from a size 11 foot. Also strange was that the officers could clearly see a fabric print in the dirt next to the footprint, like someone had been sitting outside that window for quite a long time. It was essentially a butt mark in the dirt. Back at the hospital, officers from the local Edmond Police Department, alongside state detectives, went to go get the female victim's story for a second time. It wasn't like they didn't believe her, but there were parts of her story that just seemed so strange. Like, number one, why was Gary killed and she wasn't? If she was telling the truth about being assaulted for nearly 3 hours, why wouldn't he kill her too? They knew Gary had been stabbed over 24 times in what was clearly a rage killing, and they wondered why the killer spared her life. That detail suggested to detectives that either Gary or his girlfriend knew the attacker. Number two, the detail about her saying the man was only wearing a pair of gloves and underwear. No shoes, no socks, no shirt, just a pair of underwear. Why would someone break into a home only in their underwear, yielding a knife and commit a crime like this? The other strange part was that none of the neighbors reported seeing anything suspicious that night. So, had this man run down the street only in his underwear, covered in blood after stabbing Gary 24 times? Why didn't anyone see him? Did he just slip into the night and get away? So it wasn't like the police didn't believe the woman, they just needed to make sure that everything she said added up. And pretty quickly, they got the answer to that question. She was given 2 polygraph exams and passed both of them with flying colors. The police also knew from the luminol tests that everything she said seemed to line up with the evidence inside the house. So pretty quickly, the police were able to rule her out. But that conclusion only led to more questions. Who was this mystery underwear guy? After going through the entire house, detectives were able to photograph several footprint impressions. They knew they didn't belong to Gary because they were much bigger than his feet. They also removed several pieces of tile from the bathroom and carpet from the living room to preserve the foot impressions so they could be used for comparison later on. Something the female victim told detectives stood out, and that was when she said that before going to bed that night, she took a shower. Again, it's a hot summer night, so taking a shower before bed would have felt pretty good. The reason why detectives found this part of her story interesting was the fact that the bedroom window where they saw the butt and foot impressions in the dirt outside faced directly toward the bathroom, which was right in front of the shower. So the question on everyone's mind was, could this have been a peeping Tom? You've got a man wearing only his underwear. He gains access to the house by cutting open a screen window. You've got his butt impression and feet impression directly outside a window that faces the bathroom where the female victim took a shower. All of this seems to point in the direction that we've got a case of a peeping Tom. Some guy was posted up outside this couple's bedroom window, snooping inside. And when he saw the female victim take a shower, he thought he hit the jackpot. Detectives knew that from that window, he would have had a clear shot of the bathroom. But this theory wasn't without its holes. If this were a peeping Tom, then why did things escalate to murder? And why was the murder so brutal? One possible explanation the police explored was that the attacker thought he won the lottery when he saw the girlfriend take a shower. So he entered the home thinking she was alone, and he would assault her. But when he did, he was confronted by Gary after hearing the strange noises coming from the living room. So, having to think on his feet, he stabbed Gary to death, then went on to assault the female for several hours. So the police wondered if this had started as a simple peeping Tom incident, but things had escalated to murder. They thought the girlfriend was likely the primary target, and Gary was simply collateral damage in this attacker's plan. This theory was even supported by the criminal profile that local and state authorities had the FBI come up with. According to the FBI's profile, the killer was likely between 22 and 27 years old. He had the education of a high school graduate. He probably lived within walking distance of the victim's home. That would explain how easily he was able to get inside. He was also very likely traumatized by what he had done. The FBI really thought this was this person's first and only murder. And if that was true, he would have been very traumatized by what he had done. If he had only been a creeper before this, but now he was a full-blown murderer, that would have left him very anxious and afraid. He probably even felt bad for what happened. So the FBI thought it was likely that the suspect had moved away from the area of Edmond shortly after the murder. He wouldn't want to stay in town. They also suspected he lost a lot of weight shortly after the murder because of all the stress. The FBI's criminal profile lined up with how the female victim described him. Although she didn't get a good look at him because she wasn't wearing her glasses, she told investigators that he was in his early 20s, had blonde hair, was under 6 feet tall, and had a scruffy beard. So based on that rough description, the police had a sketch artist create an image of how this person might have looked. From there, the image was circulated throughout the media all across Oklahoma. But it wasn't enough to draw in any substantial leads or suspects. So the first few months of the investigation were pretty slow. But all of that was about to change as soon as the police got the name of their first suspect. His name was 18-year-old Bill Winters, and initially, he seemed to check off all the boxes they were looking for in a suspect. He was young, just a teenager. He lived 2 blocks away from the crime scene. His parents had recently moved out of state and left the house to him, where he stayed by himself. And not long after the murder happened, he left town. He packed up and moved back in with his parents in their new house in Missouri. This lined up perfectly with what the FBI profile said. They felt pretty confident that the killer would look for ways to leave the state of Oklahoma after the murder to try to get away from this. So Bill Winters was brought down to the Edmond police station, where he voluntarily provided a DNA sample, as well as had a foot impression taken. Those were important because those were the 2 biggest pieces of evidence. The police had the killer's DNA from the female victim's rape kit, and they had the blood footprints found throughout the house. But when the results came back, they were incredibly disappointing. Bill Winters couldn't be their suspect. His DNA didn't match the rape kit, and his feet were clearly not a match. Just like fingerprints, our feet have distinct ridges on them. And when they were compared to the prints found at the crime scene, they didn't match. So Bill Winters was officially cleared as a suspect, and the police were back at square one. At this point, 3 years had gone by, and during that time, there was a real fear that whoever did this might just actually get away with it. People in this part of town started double-checking their doors at night, making sure they were deadbolted and locked. They reinforced their windows and screen doors so no one could get inside in the middle of the night. What made this case so scary was that the murder victim, Gary Larson, didn't have any enemies. Neither did his girlfriend, who had also become a victim. Gary Larson was just a good guy who lived a relatively normal life. He was well liked by virtually everyone. Before his murder, he was divorced and a pretty successful businessman. He had only been dating his girlfriend for a little while when he was killed, so not even she could think of a single person who would want to do this. Most articles I read about him while researching this episode described him as smart and someone who cared a lot for people. He was just a totally average guy without a single enemy. So I think that's part of what made this case so scary for the people living in Edmond. If this could happen to someone like Gary Larson, then it could happen to anyone. No one was safe from this type of violence. About 3 years into the investigation, the local and state police got another tip. This time, it came from an inmate at a local jail saying he thought he knew who the killer was. He said his former roommate at the time had come home one night covered in blood, saying he had just murdered someone. That roommate was a man named Bob Johnson. So now the police are thinking they have a promising suspect, something they hadn't had in nearly 3 years. Not since Bill Winters was cleared. It looked even more promising after the police saw a photograph of Bob Johnson. He looked almost identical to the forensic sketch that had been created from the female victim's memory. So at this point, the police wonder if they could finally have their guy. Within days of the tip coming in, detectives were able to track down Bob Johnson's ex-wife, who had some pretty interesting things to say about him. She said he had a major drug problem and would often break into people's homes to feed his drug habit. So after speaking with her, the police brought Johnson in for questioning, but he immediately denied any involvement. He might have been addicted to drugs and a convicted burglar, but he wasn't a killer. But the police had waited a very long time to get to this point, so they weren't just going to take his word for it and let him go. So they brought Gary Larson's girlfriend down to the police station to see if she could identify him. Instead of looking directly at Bob Johnson, they put a photo lineup in front of her that included Johnson's photograph. And almost instantly, she recognized Johnson and said he was the guy who attacked her. But before anyone could celebrate, they needed to be 100% sure they had the right person in custody. So they got Johnson's DNA and also took an impression of his bare feet. But that's when everyone was hit in the face with something they weren't expecting at all. They weren't a match. His DNA didn't fit the killer's genetic profile, and the foot impressions were totally off. Johnson was not the killer. This was a massive blow to the investigation. The police really thought they had the suspect. Even the surviving victim herself had identified him in a photo lineup. But the forensic evidence just didn't match. It couldn't have been him, which meant the real killer was still out there somewhere. After that, the case went cold once again for another 3 long years. It wasn't until the local police decided to revisit the case that they got another strange clue. About 3 years later, a few detectives went back to the crime scene, the house where the murder and assault occurred. It had sat vacant since the crime happened, so they went back, hoping to find something they might have missed during their original investigation. They weren't really expecting to find anything, but they thought it was still worth a shot, and boy, were they right. While going through the vacant house, they found something that hadn't been there before: a bra sitting underneath the broken window where the killer had entered the house. And after speaking with the female victim, the police were able to confirm that it was her bra. Detectives knew it wasn't uncommon for criminals to keep a trophy from their victims. It's a way for them to remember and relive the crime anytime they want to. So that's what they began to think happened. After assaulting the female victim, the suspect took her bra with him as a trophy. He held onto it for several months, even years, before he decided to return to the house to relive what he had done. And while he was there, he either intentionally or unintentionally left the victim's bra behind inside the house. But that wasn't the only realization the police had after the bra's discovery. This also strengthened their belief that the suspect was familiar with the neighborhood. They had connections there. They either lived there at the time of the crime, or they had family members who did. So the police knew their suspect felt comfortable going back there months or years after the crime. 18 years went by, and the murder of Gary Larson and the assault of his girlfriend remained unsolved. But it wasn't for a lack of trying. This was a case that everyone, including the Edmond and state police, really wanted to solve. Everyone wanted there to be justice. But for 18 long years, there wasn't any. Throughout that time, the police had identified dozens of suspects across 7 different states. But each time their DNA was compared to the crime scene, there was never a match. The same could be said about the footprints. The police had good suspects, but the forensic evidence was never on their side. By the spring of 2004, there was a major break. A family living in Edmond had called the police to report a peeping Tom. They said they had seen a man hanging around their house on multiple occasions. Sometimes they even caught him peering through the windows and even taking photographs of them while they were inside. For a while, they weren't able to catch him. But on one spring night in 2004, the family was able to call the police while the peeping Tom was outside their home. And this time, the police got there and apprehended him. The guy was identified as 40-year-old Jonathan Scott Graham, and when the police showed up, there were many red flags about him. The first was that he was barefoot. The second was that he lived with his parents in a house only a couple of blocks away from where Gary Larson had been murdered. So the police executed a search warrant on Jonathan Graham's home, thinking this might be bigger than just a typical peeping Tom case. They could already charge him for what he did to this family, but they also wondered if he could be connected to the other case from 1986. And while going through his home, the police felt more and more confident they had their guy. On Graham's computer, they found several troubling things, including child porn and photos of women inside their house that he had secretly taken. They also found a very disturbing bag inside one of his closets. It was what the police would describe as a rape bag. Inside it were 3 pairs of handcuffs, condoms, lubricant, sex toys, lock-picking tools, a black bandana, and a pair of all-black clothing. It was everything you would need to commit a sexual assault. Jonathan Scott Graham wasn't just a creeper who liked to look into people's homes. He was someone far, far scarier. On May 1st, 2004, Graham was admitted into the Oklahoma City jail on felony peeping Tom charges, 15 counts of possessing child pornography, and 2 counts of taking clandestine photographs. This gave detectives an opportunity to question him about the 1986 crime. He was already in jail on unrelated charges, so they knew he wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. Although he denied any involvement when questioned, he was still required to submit a DNA sample and have an impression of his right foot taken. The samples were taken to the lab for comparison, but the results didn't happen overnight. Sometimes comparisons can take some time to complete, and in a case like this, you want to make sure you get it right. You just can't afford to make any mistakes. So the police had to wait a few days before they got the results from the crime lab, but the wait was well worth it. A few days later, detectives got a call from the lab saying there was a perfect match to both the DNA and the foot sample. Graham was a perfect match to the genetic profile pulled from the female victim's rape kit, and his foot impression matched the ones found at the crime scene. Just like fingerprints, his unique foot impressions were left behind inside the house. Finally, after 18 long years, the police in Oklahoma had the forensic evidence on their side. When comparing Jonathan Scott Graham to the FBI's original profile, they were pretty much spot on. The FBI had said that the killer was in his 20s. In 1986, Graham was 20 years old. They said he likely lived within blocks of the crime scene. Graham lived with his parents in the same neighborhood as Gary and his girlfriend. The FBI thought he likely lost a lot of weight after the killing because of all the stress. Graham did lose a lot of weight and joined the Army not long after the murder. That was something else the FBI got right. They said the suspect probably left Oklahoma. The FBI thought this was likely his first and only murder. They were probably right about that as well. Jonathan Scott Graham was definitely a creep and a criminal, but this was the only murder he ever committed, or at least what we know of so far. After he got out of the military, Graham returned to his parents' house a few blocks away from the crime scene. Instead of moving somewhere else and staying as far away from there as possible, he returned to the place where he felt the most comfortable. That gave him the opportunity to revisit the crime scene a few years later and leave the victim's bra inside the house. It was also another thing the FBI was right about. The killer felt comfortable in the area of Edmond, Oklahoma. Once they had the forensic evidence in hand, that was enough to secure murder charges against Jonathan Graham. Initially, the district attorney announced they would seek the death penalty against him, but the female victim didn't want to go to trial and testify against him. This was obviously a very traumatic event for her and something she's had to live with for so many years. So going to trial and seeking the death penalty just wasn't something she wanted to relive. And neither did Gary's family. I think everyone wanted this to be over as quickly and easily as possible. So in January of 2005, prosecutors approached Graham with a deal. If he pleaded guilty to the murder, they would take the death penalty off the table. But the deal wasn't just to save his life. There were also two other stipulations to the plea deal. Number one, Graham had to admit how he did it and why. This was so that the female victim and Gary's family could get the closure they needed. And number two, if he were to be found guilty of another murder they didn't know about, then the death penalty was back on. Just because the FBI didn't think he committed any other murders, that doesn't mean that's the truth. So if Graham was responsible for someone else's murder, then the state could pursue the death penalty. In the end, he accepted the deal. And with that deal, we got to hear from his own mouth why he did this. In a tape interview, Graham said he went out that night to peep into people's windows, something he did all the time, but the location he chose was different. Normally, he only peeped into homes on the same street as his parents' house, but on this particular night, he decided to go a few blocks away, to Gary Larson's house. He said he picked that house because the light was on. And when he looked through one of the windows, he saw a woman getting ready for bed. He watched as she showered because he had a clear view from the window. That's when he said he left for a while, but eventually came back to the house and saw that the lights were off. He then took off his clothes and went inside, thinking the woman was alone. The police were right. He had cut the screen to get inside. When he got in the house, he said he wandered around for a bit, but he must have made too much noise because that's when Gary confronted him in the living room. He said Gary yelled at him to get out, but he knew Gary was much bigger than him. So instead of running out, he decided to attack because he didn't know what else to do. He said he didn't remember how many times he stabbed Gary and couldn't remember much of the attack because he was so surprised by the whole thing. Graham then said he heard a woman screaming, and that's when Gary's girlfriend appeared in the living room. She had seen him, so he decided to chase her down the hallway into the bedroom, where he tried multiple times to suffocate her. But he didn't really know what he was doing. This wasn't something he had planned for. Graham said the woman kept telling him not to kill her, and for some reason, he listened to her. Because after assaulting her for about 3 hours, he decided to leave without killing her too. For his sentence, Jonathan Scott Graham received 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He took the deal and pleaded guilty to murder, rape, and burglary. This means he will never walk free outside prison walls for the rest of his natural life. For nearly 2 decades, the murder of Gary Larson seemed like it might remain one of those cases that slowly fades into the background. In the end, it wasn't a confession or a lucky guess that solved this case. It was the evidence. The DNA preserved from the victim's rape kit and the barefoot impressions left in blood on the floor of that house in 1986. Those pieces of forensic evidence waited quietly for 18 years until technology and the right suspect finally caught up. Forensic Tales is a Rockefeller audio production. The show is written and produced by me, Courtney Fretwell. If you'd like to support the show and help fund research, production, and editing, you can do so with a small monthly contribution on Patreon. Patreon supporters get early access to ad-free episodes and exclusive bonus content. You can learn more at patreon.com/forensictales. And if you enjoy the show, leaving a positive rating or review really helps others discover it. For a full list of sources used in this episode, visit forensictales.com. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next week. Until then, remember, not all stories have happy endings.